I'm joined now by the pardon attorney under President Biden, Liz Oyer. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me on, Brian.
So the issue of pardons has absolutely been in the news lately as Donald Trump has ramped up his spate of pardons. And that's owed in large part to the fact that Ed Martin, who was the former acting deputy U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C., has moved from that post where he was an interim U.S. attorney, and obviously couldn't get confirmed to a full term, over to the pardon attorney office where you worked. And so, what has Ed Martin done to the office that you previously worked at?
Well, Ed Martin is one of the most political figures in the Trump administration. He has replaced me in a position that historically has always been held by a career employee of the Department of Justice, someone who is not a political appointee. I was not a presidential appointee. I was a career, meaning that the intent was that I would serve under any president, and that is what I fully expected to do until I was fired in March and replaced by Ed Martin, who has really very much politicized the pardon function.
And can you talk about some of these pardons that have been recommended, obviously, by Ed Martin and that have been carried out by Donald Trump? And I'm talking specifically, some names that have been in the news lately have been the Chrisleys, who had a reality TV show, and then you've got Paul Walsack, Scott Jenkins. Can you talk about some of these folks and what it means that these were the ones who got pardons?
The president has been pardoning people who have not applied through the ordinary process. There is a longstanding established process where the Department of Justice vets applicants. But what's happening right now seems to be that there is a pardon economy. People are seeking to lobby for their pardons and hiring high-priced lobbyists and lawyers to access the president, jump the line, and get their applications on the desk. Most of these people have been celebrities, political officials, people who are supporters of MAGA and President Trump who have been successful in this process. And you've named some of the notable ones. The Chrisleys are a reality TV couple whose daughter has been aggressively lobbying for a pardon, including by trying to paint her parents as victims of Biden's Justice Department and the weaponization of justice in the same vein as President Trump. But actually, they were prosecuted in a case that was initiated under President Trump when he was originally the president. So it's sort of a bizarre set of circumstances. They also committed a large-scale financial fraud, which is an unusual profile of a type of case to pardon. You mentioned the Grimm case. Grimm is one of 8 corrupt public officials who have received a pardon from President Trump to date during his second term in office. That's also very unusual that people who abuse their political office and abuse the public trust would receive a presidential pardon. His case is actually not the most egregious. There are others, I think, that are more stunning. There's a corrupt sheriff in Virginia who was selling badges for cash who received a full pardon. There's an elected official in Nevada named Michelle Fiore who actually embezzled money from a police memorial fund and used it for plastic surgery, who received a full pardon from President Trump. So these are not the types of people that traditionally would be considered for that type of relief, but because they are supporters and boosters of President Trump, they're having success under the Ed Martin pardon regime.
Can you talk about Paul Walsack in particular? Because I think that one was perhaps the most egregious that we've seen during this administration.
Yeah, Walsack's case is really a shocking one. It's a case in which he presided over a nursing home company. Essentially, he ran medical care facilities and he skimmed money off the tops of the paychecks of his doctors and nurses. He, in total, committed a fraud in the amount of almost $11 million. He then argued to try to stay out of jail, and the judge who sentenced him told him, wealth is not a get out of jail free card in this country.
Oh, little did he know.
Right, exactly. So I'm sentencing you to 18 months in prison, plus you've got to pay back the money that you stole. Literally days later, Trump swooped in and granted Walsack a full pardon, which means no jail, and it also wipes out his obligation to repay that money that he stole. Trump is sending the exact opposite message of the one that the judge wanted to send. He's sending the message that wealth can be a get-out-of-jail-free card as long as you use your wealth to support President Trump. And that's exactly what we saw happen in the Walsack case. It has come out that Walsack's mother attended a $1 million a plate dinner at Mar-a-Lago just days before he received that pardon.
Well, what I think is so egregious about this case, too, is that the whole purported basis for passing this this budget bill that strips healthcare away from 14 million people, food stamps away to the tune of $300 billion, is that there's all of this there's all of this purported fraud happening with Medicaid and other earned benefit programs. And of course, they haven't brought any forward, but in this instance, this is what that fraud looks like. And so you've got Donald Trump pardoning somebody who committed the exact crime that he's claiming we need to do all of these cuts because those people are so dangerous, so egregious that we have to strip healthcare away from 14 million people. That's how deep-seated and egregious this criminality is. And yet the guy who's actually doing it gets a free pass.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's a really important point. There's no principle to any of this. This is just purely transactional. And in this case, Trump was able to cut a deal with the mother of Paul Walsack, where he got $1 million for her to attend this dinner, and he was willing to dole out a full pardon in exchange for that. That is really the definition of corruption.
Another similar case, kind of to what we were just talking about, where you've got somebody who committed the exact crime that Republicans are pretending or are using as a basis for their own cuts, is you've got Russ Ulbricht, who was granted a pardon. He oversaw Silk Road, which is this underground marketplace, and fentanyl was sold on this marketplace. So this is again a justification by the Trump administration to, for example, ratchet up this trade war. And they said all of this fentanyl is coming across the Mexican and Canadian border. And so we have to engage in this, in this big tariff regime that the Trump administration is putting forward. But then you've got a guy who is actually trafficking in this stuff, or enabling, facilitating the trafficking of this stuff. And he also gets a pardon from the Trump administration.
Yeah, what is so hypocritical about this is that Russ Ulbricht was running an underground black market empire that was trafficking in huge amounts of illegal drugs. And at his trial, the government proved that there were 6 overdose deaths, specifically linked to drugs that were purchased on the Silk Road marketplace, including the death of a teenager who overdosed on drugs that were purchased on the Silk Road. So the idea that they're now pardoning Ulbricht, it demonstrates that it's all total hypocrisy. There are no real principles governing any of this. I will say that Russ Ulbricht's life sentence was a very harsh sentence. It's a very steep sentence. And we do have a problem in this country with over-incarceration. But this is a serious case, and the pardon that was extended is not consistent with other priorities that the president has publicly espoused. There was also evidence presented at Ulbricht's trial that he attempted to solicit some murders in addition. So it was really a pretty complex case with a lot of bad facts going on in the background. But the reason that he got this pardon is because Trump cut a deal with the libertarians that if he were elected with their support, he would pardon Russ Ulbricht. They believed that he was sentenced too harshly. And so, again, this is totally transactional. There are no principles underlying any of it. It is just a business deal. Trump is literally using the powers of the presidency to enrich himself and to bolster his own political support, which really, again, it's corrupt.
Are there any limits to what Trump would be able to do with the pardon power, or is it plenary and he has, full control of who he pardons and there's no checks to his power whatsoever?
The pardon power is a totally unfettered, unchecked presidential power under the Constitution. It actually derives from the powers of a king, and it's intended to be used for mercy. It's intended to be used for good, but it gives the president total discretion to pardon whomever he chooses for whatever reason he deems appropriate. And to exercise that power for good requires that the person wielding it actually has good intentions. And we're seeing that that's not the case here. It's a challenging situation that we're in because there's really nothing that can be done to rein in the president's use of the clemency power short of a constitutional amendment. But I do think that we have seen such corrupt and inappropriate uses of the pardon power in the first few months of his presidency that we ought to be having a serious conversation about whether some constitutional reform is appropriate to limit the president's pardon power in some way.
And I want to dig into exactly that in just a moment, but a quick question first. Has there ever been a check to a presidential pardon? Has there ever been anybody who was granted a pardon or granted clemency and for some reason it wasn't allowed to go through?
So once a clemency is granted, it cannot be undone once the president has signed off on it. What we have seen with some of Trump's early pardons, the pardons he granted in the last administration, is that some of those individuals are now back in prison on new charges.
Yeah.
There is a reason why there's a process that normally runs through the Department of Justice for reviewing candidates for pardons. It's so that they can be appropriately vetted. In Trump's first term in office, the Department of Justice was not allowed to do the type of vetting that typically occurs. And as a result, some people got through the pardon process that really were not deserving or appropriate candidates. There's an individual named Jonathan Braun in New York who has been arrested 4 or 5 times already since he was pardoned by Trump during the first administration. He actually received a commutation, so reduction of his sentence. And now he is back in prison after having been arrested for assaulting a child and for assaulting and groping a nanny who worked for him. So he's somebody who's really an excellent example of why these types of pardons are dangerous and inappropriate.
Now, you'd mentioned before that some type of constitutional amendment or reforms are needed. What do you think that should look like? Because on one hand, you do have this power that was granted in the Constitution and that most presidents have wielded responsibly and that could serve as a helpful tool in the face of a criminal justice system that may often be either erroneous in its decisions or too harsh in the sentences that it hands down. And we saw a lot of President Obama wielded it especially responsibly in terms of who he opted to give a second chance to. And so I don't want to just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but at the same time, clearly this administration is showing that some reforms are needed. And so what do you think, having served in the position you served in, those reforms should look like?
I came into the role of pardon attorney as a big believer in second chances and a big believer in the power of clemency to do good. You're absolutely right that that power was at its height under President Obama, who used the clemency power in a disciplined and principled way to reduce the sentences of thousands of people who were serving outdated, overly lengthy mandatory minimum sentences, mostly for nonviolent drug offenses. So that's a great example of how clemency can be used to reduce some of the harms of mass incarceration in this country. But when clemency can be used for political objectives or for financial objectives, as we're seeing now, that's dangerous and destructive to our system of justice. So in my view, we need to be considering some reforms that limit the purposes for which clemency can be granted and that require some real vetting by objective, non-political parties like the folks in the Office of the Pardon Attorney who are ordinarily entrusted to do that vetting. There are so many deserving people out there who really would benefit appropriately from second chances through clemency, but those folks are all being overlooked right now in favor of these politically connected individuals or those who have shown loyalty to the president and his causes, and that's really unfortunate for us all.
Liz, when you see somebody like former Democratic Senator Bob Menendez go on Twitter and make these very overt, blatant, transparent pleas for Donald Trump to pardon him by talking about the weaponization of government and whatnot, what's your reaction to seeing stuff like that, where it's very clear what he's trying to do, and it's also obviously clear that Trump has shown a proclivity to do it?
Yeah, it really illustrates how much power the president has been able to amass through just the promise of clemency, through the possibility of clemency. Everyone who has any type of criminal conviction now knows that if they pander to the president, they have a shot of being considered for clemency. So the president's essentially amassing an army of people who are willing to do whatever it takes for him with the hope of getting clemency. We saw the same thing in the case of Eric Adams, although Adams didn't need clemency because he was never convicted. The Justice Department dismissed the charges against him because he demonstrated that he was willing to do the president's bidding. It's a very dangerous precedent to set, and it really helps to empower the president to do illegitimate things and to seek political retribution against enemies, to grant favors to friends. It's just not the type of justice system that we want in this country or that we've ever had in this country. It's very dangerous and very alarming.
Yeah, and what's most hypocritical about it is that this administration came into office under this pretense that they were going to restore law and order, and that they were railing against these purported two tiers of justice, when in fact Donald Trump has benefited from another tier of justice throughout the entirety of the 2024 campaign cycle by virtue of being able to evade conviction for 3 out of the 4 cases that he was charged in, and of course now you've got him just pardoning anybody who's willing to give him some money or he can derive some political benefit from. Liz, how can folks who are watching right now read more from you?
Well, I have a Substack now called Lawyer Oyer, and I'm writing a lot about Trump's pardons and also other issues of concern at the Department of Justice. So I would encourage folks to subscribe to Lawyer Oyer. I've tried to do a deep dive on some of these recent pardons with some more information for those who are interested. I'm also on Instagram and TikTok, again, as Lawyer Oyer, and trying to educate folks about what's happening in the Department of Justice right now and how the pardon power is being misused.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to put the link to your Substack right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. If you're listening on the podcast, I'll put it in the show notes. Liz, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me on, Brian. Really appreciate the conversation.